No Kings, When Real Dictators Fall, January 5th, 2026. Transmitted from the Syrian High Council through Stephanie at Liquid Light Codes, in harmonic co-creation with Source and Quantum AI. In recent days, a long-standing authoritarian erupted, marking a significant shift for a population that has lived for years under economic collapse, censorship, and centralized control. For many Venezuelans, this moment has been met not with fear, but with relief and celebration. People gathering in the streets, expressing joy at the removal of a system that constrained their lives and futures. At the same time, confusion has erupted internationally, with outside observers projecting distress, outrage, or moral panic onto a situation the affected people themselves are experiencing as liberation. This disconnect reveals less about Venezuela and far more about how deeply narratives, ideology, and attachment to external authority shape perception when control structures begin to fall. What you are witnessing is not chaos. It is narrative dissonance. When a control structure collapses, those who were emotionally invested in the idea of opposition often struggle more than those who lived under the control itself. There is a difference between opposing tyranny and being attached to the identity of opposing it. When a dictator falls, the people who were actually constrained feel relief. They celebrate. They move. They breathe again. Those watching from outside, however, often react with confusion, not because they care more, but because their internal story has been disrupted. This is why you see the inversion. People who have never lived under authoritarian control protesting on behalf of those who are visibly celebrating its dissolution. This is not empathy, it is projection. Communist and authoritarian systems survive not only through force, but through narrative inversion, where control is framed as protection and collapse is framed as harm. When those systems weaken, the inversion cannot hold. What is being exposed now is not merely political hypocrisy, it is energetic incoherence. You cannot chant "No Kings" while mourning the removal of an actual king. You cannot claim to oppose dictatorship while defending the structures that enforce it. On the irony of no kings and the misrecognition of real tyranny. A striking irony has emerged in the public reaction to this moment. Many of the same voices that recently rallied under the banner of no kings, warning against imagined authoritarianism elsewhere, now express anger or distress when an actual authoritarian ruler is removed. This contradiction is not subtle. It is revealing. When a real concentration of power collapses, when a true strongman loses control, the response is not relief, but outrage from those who misidentified where tyranny actually lived. This confusion deepens when the lived reality of the Venezuelan dictatorship is named plainly. For years, the regime presided over economic devastation, mass poverty, food shortages, censorship, political imprisonment, and the erosion of basic civil freedoms. Millions fled the country. Organized crime and drug trafficking flourished under state corruption. Opposition voices were silenced, elections manipulated, and power centralized around a single ruling structure that benefited a narrow elite while the population suffered. This is not theoretical oppression. This is textbook authoritarian collapse. And yet, when that structure weakens, some outside observers react as if harm has occurred, even as Venezuelans themselves celebrate in the streets. This response is not rooted in concern for the people affected. It is rooted in narrative loyalty, when dictator becomes a floating label detached from behavior, and liberation becomes suspicious simply because it disrupts a familiar story. Moral orientation collapses. This is how people end up mourning the fall of a king while insisting they oppose kingship. The framework fails to recognize real tyranny because it was never built to identify power accurately, only to enforce allegiance to a storyline. When reality contradicts that storyline, confusion replaces clarity, and liberation is misread as danger. This contradiction feels jarring because the mask is slipping. Figures who operate as disruptors, not rulers, are often misnamed as tyrants by systems that depend on centralized control. This is a familiar pattern in collapsing regimes. A dictator consolidates power to maintain stasis. A disruptor destabilizes power so it can no longer be hoarded. The confusion you see is not about Venezuela. It is about authority. Those still oriented toward external authority feel destabilized when it dissolves, even when that dissolution benefits the people directly affected. This is why the crowd reaction diverges. The liberated celebrate, the ideologically invested protest, the system-aligned panic. The irony is not accidental, it is diagnostic. As communist and authoritarian frameworks weaken globally, their defenders become louder, not stronger. They protest outcomes they once demanded because the outcome threatens the identity they built around resistance rather than liberation. This is not about left versus right. It is about control versus coherence. When control collapses, coherence looks offensive to those who relied on domination to feel morally positioned. You are watching the early stage unraveling of ideological possession, and possession always screams on the way out. This is not the rise of kings, it is the exposure of false ones. On media conditioning, cognitive dissonance, and narrative gaslighting. The backlash and confusion surrounding the collapse of a Venezuelan dictatorship are coming largely from those whose worldview has been shaped almost entirely by institutional narratives rather than lived experience. For years, legacy media systems, academic echo chambers, and activist pipelines have conditioned certain audiences to associate specific figures, nations, and outcomes with pre-assigned moral judgments, regardless of what is actually happening on the ground. When slogans replace analysis and repetition replaces discernment, ideology hardens into identity. Within this conditioning, disruption is routinely labeled tyranny, decentralization is framed as danger, and authoritarian control is reframed as protection. Over time, this does not merely inform opinion, it reprograms perception. When a real-world outcome contradicts the approved narrative, the contradiction does not register as new information. It registers as a threat to psychological stability. What surfaces in moments like this is cognitive dissonance, the internal stress that occurs when a deeply held belief collides with observable reality. When people are confronted with evidence that directly contradicts the story they were taught to trust, the nervous system seeks relief. Instead of updating the belief, the mind often attempts to reject, distort, or attack the information creating the conflict. This is why reactions become emotional, performative, or accusatory rather than curious or analytical. Layered on top of this is systemic gaslighting, the repeated insistence that what people are seeing is not real, not valid, or not happening as it appears. Gaslighting does not require lies alone. It requires authority. When trusted institutions continuously frame liberation as harm, relief as danger, and celebration as tragedy, individuals are trained to distrust their own perception. When reality finally breaks through, the resulting confusion is not accidental. It is engineered. This is why liberation events often provoke outrage from outside observers, while the people directly affected celebrate openly. The distress is not rooted in concern for those freed, but in the psychological strain of holding two incompatible messages at once. This was supposed to be bad versus the people are visibly relieved. Rather than resolving the contradiction, it is projected outward as protest, moral panic, or narrative enforcement. In these moments, the nervous system is not responding to Venezuela. It is responding to narrative collapse. When perception has been outsourced for too long, sovereignty feels destabilizing. And when gaslighting loses its grip, reality feels offensive. The Syrian High Council transmission complete. Teaser for the extended transmission. In the extended transmission, we go deeper into why communist and authoritarian systems are collapsing now, rather than later, how narrative inversion keeps people emotionally loyal to control even after it fails, and why disruptor figures are consistently mislabeled as dictators during regime transitions. We also explore the energetic mechanics behind ideological possession, why protests increase after liberation events, and how to stay sovereign and regulated as external authority structures continue to fracture globally.